The rape of Carol Danvers. In Avengers 200, Carol, known then as Miss Marvel, suddenly finds herself pregnant with no memory of how it happened. Over the course of just a few days, she carries the child to term, gives birth, and watches as her son rapidly grows into adulthood. The man, Marcus, reveals that he manipulates time and reality to bring her into another dimension, Limbo, where he could be born. The twist, he is also the one who impregnated her. The comic tries to pass all of this off as some sort of cosmic love story, but things aren't as innocent as they seem. Marcus admits to abducting Carol and influencing her mind so she would fall in love with him. While the comic never uses the word, the scenario is clear. Carol was violated while under psychological manipulation and then made to bear the child of her abuser. What makes the story even more horrifying is how casually the other Avengers react to it. Instead of confronting Marcus or even questioning the morality of what just happened, they send Carol off with him, seemingly under the assumption that she's going willingly. There's no concern for her autonomy, no anger on her behalf, just a group of supposed heroes giving their blessing to a situation that clearly wasn't right. After Marcus dies in Limbo, Carol returns to Earth in Avengers Annual 10, written by Chris Claremont, who was deeply disturbed by how the earlier story had been handled. This time, Carol speaks for herself. She explains that she had been mentally enslaved and manipulated, and she calls out the Avengers directly for their failure to protect her or even question what was happening. And for once, the story doesn't shy away from the trauma she experienced. Carol's assault was presented without consequence in the original story, and was actually romanticized. Marcus' actions were brushed off as a side effect of love, and Carol's agency was entirely stripped away. There was no sense of responsibility or care for the emotional reality of the character. Years later, even Marvel's editorial staff would openly admit how badly they had mishandled the story. Jim Shooter, Marvel's editor-in-chief at the time, called Avengers 200 a travesty, and what was meant to be a celebratory issue turned into one of the most infamous and criticized comics ever published. Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver's love story. In Ultimates 3, Marvel dove into murky and comfortable territory with Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver. Instead of maintaining the close protective bond the siblings had in the main universe, writer Jeff Loeb implied that their relationship was more than just familial. In scenes that barely tried to be subtle, Pietro and Wanda were portrayed with physical intimacy, secret glances, and possessive behavior that strongly suggested they were romantically involved. It was treated like a genuine relationship. Their dynamic was woven through the series, often shown in moments where Pietro got jealous of Wanda's interactions with other men. No one in universe seemed all that shocked either, which only added to the surreal vibe of the whole thing. Fans were left wondering why this angle was introduced in the first place. It didn't serve the story, didn't develop either character in a meaningful way, and didn't offer any kind of social commentary. It was just there, a provocative twist with no payoff except shock value. Jeff Loeb later tried to frame the storyline as a product of the twins' trauma, suggesting their close bond, formed through surviving Magneto's abuse, has spiraled into something toxic. Even if that explanation had been developed with care, it wasn't. It still wouldn't have justified the tone or presentation. There's a big clear line between writing psychologically complex characters and incest. Even readers who had stuck with the Ultimate Universe through its more violent and cynical turns were taken aback. It was one of several moments in the later Ultimate comics that made it clear the line between bold storytelling and poor taste had completely blurred, and what started as a grounded, character-driven reimagining of Marvel's greatest heroes devolved into shock for shock's sake. There's nothing wrong with exploring a story between Wanda and Pietro about their bond, their trauma, and their family legacy, but incest? Come on, it shouldn't even be a thought. It was lazy, creepy, and unnecessary. The Punisher is black now. In the early 90s, Marvel made one of the strangest and the most poorly received creation decisions in Punisher history. During the storyline The Final Days, Frank Castle's world collapses thanks to a calculated takedown by the Kingpin, echoing the tone of Daredevil Born Again. By the end of this arc, Castle is imprisoned, tortured, and left horribly scarred by his nemesis Jigsaw. When he escapes, he seeks out a plastic surgeon to repair his face. Instead of just fixing his wounds, the procedure inexplicably changes Frank's skin tone, effectively turning him into a black man. But this wasn't a disguise or temporary camouflage. Marvel wrote it as a full identity shift for the character, even though it was only for a few issues. But still, Frank Castle here is not just given new facial features, but an entirely new racial identity, with almost no thought given to the implication. The decision seemed to serve no purpose other than to awkwardly tie it into Luke Cage's appearance in the next issue, as if changing Castle's race was the only way to logically connect the two characters. It was offensive in its shallowness, reducing a deeply nuanced issue of racial identity to a narrative gimmick that no one asked for and no one wanted. It just felt widely out of place. The storyline itself is rushed and bizarrely handled. After 2 issues of Frank's operation with his new appearance, appearance, the plot hastily wraps things up with an issue titled Fade to White, where his skin tone reverts to its original shade, as if nothing happened. The lack of explanation or lasting consequence made the entire arc feel like a clumsy experiment that Marvel couldn't wait to forget. And there's no exploration of Frank's perspective. Writer Mike Baron, who had been a steady hand on The Punisher for 5 years, reportedly had little say in this creative detour. According to him, the entire Black Frank Castle idea came directly from editorial mandates. And of course, the backlash was so severe that Baron left the title immediately after finishing the arc. And to this day, Marvel has never revisited the storyline or acknowledged it in any meaningful way. And for good reason. It's remembered less as a bold experiment and more as an embarrassing misstep that exemplified how editorial interference can derail a character. The Clone Saga. What started as a callback to a 1970s arc involving a clone of Peter Parker quickly ballooned into a sprawling narrative that took over nearly every Spider-Man title for 2 years. The central hook was, what if the Peter Parker fans had been following for years wasn't the real Spider-Man? The idea was to introduce Ben Reilly, a clone who might actually be the original, and use that twist to shake up the status quo in a meaningful way. And the writers here were rewriting Spider-Man's very identity. The original intent behind the story was to streamline Peter's increasingly complicated life, even giving him a happy ending with Mary Jane, while Ben took over the role of Spider-Man. But editorial mandates and constant rewrites dragged the story out far beyond its planned scope. New villains were added, new subplots introduced, and the mystery kept shifting as the creative team struggled to keep up. What could have been a tight, shocking arc turned into a bloated saga that often felt like it was chasing its own tail, to the point where readers got whiplash from the constant reveals, retcons, and bait and switch moments. To be honest, the introduction of Ben Reilly did offer something fresh. His Scarlet Spider persona brought a more grounded street-level feel to the web-slinger role, and his personality resonated with a lot of readers. There was real potential in letting Peter retire and allowing Ben to take over, but the longer the saga went on, the more confused things became. Villains like Kane and Judas Traveler were introduced with dramatic flair, but lacked the clarity and consistency needed to make them stick. And as more clones appeared, including Gwen Stacy's, the emotional impact of the story got lost under the weight of its own complexity. Fans grew frustrated by the length, and by how it seemed to disrespect everything they had invested in Peter. Being told that the Peter Parker they'd followed for decades might be a clone felt like a betrayal, even though Marvel eventually reversed course and revealed Peter was the original after all. Despite the backlash, the Clone Saga has undergone something of a partial re-evaluation in recent years. Ben Reilly became a fan favorite and has since made several returns, often met with enthusiasm, but Saga's original run still remembered as a cautionary tale in how not to handle major status quo shifts. The idea wasn't the problem, it was the execution, the endless rewrites, and the editorial chaos behind the scenes that turned a compelling concept into a prolonged narrative mess. And what could have been a bold new chapter became one of the most infamous roller coasters in Spider-Man history. Starfox's sexual assault allegations. Starfox, also known as Eros of Titan, had long been portrayed as the charming flirt of the Marvel Universe. That ability wasn't metaphorical. His actual power allows him to simulate the brain's pleasure centers, meaning he can influence emotions, mood, and even attraction. For years, this was played off as harmless fun. He was the smooth-talking ladies' man of the cosmos, cracking jokes and seducing women across galaxies. But behind all of that, there was something far darker that no one seemed willing to address, until She-Hulk issue 6. Dan Slott took a bold step by putting Starfox on trial for sexual assault. The story opens with a woman accusing Starfox of manipulating her emotions during an intimate encounter. She didn't consent to being influenced by an external force, especially not one that altered how she felt about him. Starfox, in turn, hires She-Hulk to defend him, setting up a deeply uncomfortable, thoughtful courtroom drama. What makes the story land is how seriously it takes the situation. She-Hulk, normally confident and clear-headed, is visibly rattled. She begins to question her own past interactions with Starfox, and wonders if she too had unknowingly been affected. The case doesn't revolve around whether Starfox is a monster, it asks whether someone with powers that override free will can ever engage in a consensual relationship. It becomes less about proving guilt and more about examining accountability. The trial forces Marvel to strip away the humor and swagger that had previously defined Eros and ask what kind of man he actually is when charm isn't a superpower but a weapon. By the end, Starfox is quietly reaching out of the narrative, leaving behind a bitter sense of ambiguity. He's not imprisoned, but he is not exonerated either. The storyline marked a major shift, not just for the character, but for Marvel's willingness to tackle difficult topics head-on. The introduction of Miles Morales. When Ultimate Fallout 4 revealed a new Spider-Man under the mask, Miles Morales, as a young Afro-Latino kid from Brooklyn, it sent shockwaves through comic book fandom. The death of Peter Parker in the Ultimate Universe had left a void, and Miles' step-in was genuinely a cultural moment. Some praised Marvel for finally making a mainstream superhero lineup more inclusive. Others, less generously, claimed the move was forced or driven by political correctness. But Miles wasn't a token gesture or a gimmick. Brian Michael Bendis and Sara Pichelli gave him a grounded origin with emotional weight and sincerity. He wasn't trying to replace Peter, he was trying to live up to his example. Raised by a loving, complicated family, Miles came into his powers reluctantly, scared of the responsibility that came with them. His journey reflected a lot of what made Peter Parker so beloved: vulnerability, guilt, perseverance, and that ever-present struggle to balance everyday life with something much bigger. Readers saw a teenager dealing with culture, community, expectations, and fear, all while trying to save people who didn't even know his name. And it was never about erasing Peter Parker. It was about acknowledging that the mask could mean something to more than one kind of person. And in the years that followed, that idea only got stronger. The real turning point came with Into the Spider-Verse in 2018. Miles explored into the mainstream as the heart of an animated masterpiece that embraced everything that made him special. By then, he'd already headlined multiple comic series, joined the main Marvel universe, and become a staple of crossover events. But Spider-Verse turned him into a generational icon. Now, Miles is one of Marvel's most beloved characters. He's not the Black Spider-Man, he is just Spider-Man. His impact reaches beyond comic book stores and conventions. He's in Halloween costumes, video games, his own trilogy, and most importantly, TikTok. And despite the initial resistance, he's come to represent what Spider-Man has always stood for: Iron Man's betrayal as a double agent. In Avengers: The Crossing, the storyline dropped the revelation that Tony Stark, the heroic face of the Avengers, had secretly been working as a sleeper agent for Kang the Conqueror. Not recently, but for years. According to the story, Kang had manipulated Tony's mind long ago, turning him into a traitor embedded within the team. It wasn't a trick, a clone, or a temporary lapse. The book insisted this had been the real Tony Stark betraying his closest friends. Tony had always been portrayed as flawed, sure, but never evil. Suddenly rewriting years of character development as the result of brainwashing or hidden loyalty to a villain left readers with nothing solid to hold on to. The narrative collapsed under its own weight, filled with contradictions and gaps in logic. It tried to reframe major past events in Tony's history as deliberate sabotage, which undermined every Avenger who trusted him along the way. To fix the chaos, the writers introduce a bizarre solution. Tony dies, and the Avengers go back in time to recruit a teenage version of him to take his place. That 19-year-old Iron Man joined the team and tried to make amends for sins he hadn't even committed yet. It was a desperate patch on a story that had already lost its ways. The emotional fallout was never properly explored, and the moral implications of dragging a kid into a war he didn't cause were conveniently brushed aside in favor of high-stakes action. The story was criticized for its clumsy writing, forced retcons, and the way it twisted a core character just for shock value. Iron Man here was a plot device, being thrown around to raise stakes, and the betrayal made no sense. Marvel quietly tried to bury the whole mess. Later events like Onslaught and Avengers Forever reintroduced an adult Tony Stark and erased the Kang-controlled version from continuity. It was a soft reset, a quiet apology for going too far off the rails. Chuck Austen's Uncanny X-Men run. Taken over in 2002, Austen inherited a book with decades of lore, beloved characters, and high expectations. But instead of building on that foundation, he delivered a series of chaotic arcs filled with melodrama, bizarre relationship dynamics, and changes to canon that felt more like trolling. His run was so controversial that even longtime X-Men writer Chris Claremont called him the most hated man in comics. For many readers, it wasn't just that the stories were strange, I mean they were, but it was also very obvious that Austen didn't understand the core of the characters he was writing. For example, Austen's version of Angel went from stoic and noble to weirdly impulsive, including a storyline where he had mid-air sex with Husk in front of her horrified mother. The age gap and awkward writing didn't help, but the whole scenario was so tonally off that it felt more like parody than romance. Another example, Austen reimagined Nightcrawler's backstory to make him the literal son of a demon and part of a magical cult, throwing out years of established lore in favor of a fantasy twist that no one asked for. He also awkwardly attempted to write coming-out moments for both Iceman and Northstar, two characters who would later be confirmed as gay, but neither arc landed. The dialogue was clunky, the emotional beats felt forced, and narratives were either dropped or sidelined without resolution. resolution. What could have been moments of real progress turned into stumbles that disappointed readers and left the characters worse off. The original characters, introduced during Austen's run, didn't fare much better. Many were forgettable, some outright irritating. Sammy the Fish Boy had potential as a sweet, out-of-place student, but was killed off. Then there was the Zorn debacle, a mysterious new character with a cool design and promise of something big. But then his arc spiraled into a tangled mess involving Magneto, alternate identities, retcons, and confusion that even future writers had to clean up for years afterward. And predictably, sales dropped, fan backlash was constant, and most of Austen's ideas were quietly reversed or ignored once his run ended. The one exception that gets some credit is his work with Juggernaut, who began a slow redemption arc during this time that later writers picked up and developed. But one decent thread couldn't salvage an era that felt like it was constantly missing the mark.